The morning Grace Callahan stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the wind pulled her hat clean off her head and sent it tumbling across the main street like it was trying to warn her to turn right back around. She did not turn around. She chased that hat down the packed dirt road, past the general store and the livery stable, past a group of cowboys who laughed good-naturedly as she ran, past a water trough where a big bay horse startled at her sudden approach, and finally caught the pale blue bonnet against the wheel of a parked wagon where it had snagged on a nail. She pressed it back onto her auburn hair with both hands, took a long breath of dry Texas air, and looked up at the town she had traveled 3 weeks by rail and then coach to reach. Dusty Creek was not much to look at. There was one main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a row of buildings on either side that looked like they had been assembled in a hurry and never quite finished, a church at the far end with a modest white steeple, and mountains beyond everything, purple and enormous against a sky so blue it nearly hurt to look at. There was also, according to the letter she carried folded inside her coat, a schoolhouse that had been without a teacher for going on 7 months. Grace had answered the advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper because she needed a position, and because she was 26 years old and had decided that whatever came next in her life ought to look nothing at all like what had come before. She had grown up in Missouri, learned to teach in a proper school, and had spent 3 years instructing the children of merchants and lawyers in a city classroom that smelled of chalk and damp wool. That life was fine. It was respectable. It was the kind of life people told you to want. But Grace had always wanted something she could not entirely name, something wider and less certain, something with that enormous sky in it. She gathered her 2 traveling bags from the stagecoach driver, thanked him properly, and went to introduce herself to Mr. Aldous Webb, who served as both the town's mayor and its proprietor of the general store, and who had written her the letter of hiring. Mr. Webb was a small man with a large mustache and the harried expression of someone who had too many responsibilities and not enough hours. He shook her hand vigorously and seemed genuinely relieved to see her. "Miss Callahan," he said, "you are a genuine answer to prayer. We have 14 children of school age in this town, and not one of them has opened a proper book since September. The schoolhouse is ready. The supplies arrived last month, and school starts Monday." "That gives me 3 days," Grace said. "More than enough," Mr. Webb said, in a tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a single rectangular building of whitewashed pine with 4 windows and a small porch. Inside there were 12 rough desks arranged in rows, a blackboard, a potbelly stove, and a wall of shelves that held exactly the books and slates and chalk Mr. Webb had described. Grace walked through it twice, made a list of what she needed and what she could work with, swept it out herself that afternoon, and felt something quiet and certain settle in her chest. She could work with this. She could build something here. Her lodgings were in the home of Mrs. Eliza Purdy, a widow of 60 who rented out a back room and cooked remarkable biscuits every morning without exception. Mrs. Purdy introduced Grace to practically everyone in town within the first 24 hours simply by walking her down the main street and talking loudly. That was how Grace met most of Dusty Creek. That was not, however, how she met Lewis Ramsey. She met Lewis Ramsey on the morning of her first day of school, which did not go entirely the way she had planned. She had arrived early, built a fire in the stove against the morning chill, and written her name on the blackboard in her clearest hand. The children began arriving just after 8 o'clock, some shy and some boisterous, some scrubbed clean, and some clearly having made a valiant effort in that general direction. She greeted each one at the door, learned their names, and noted that by 8:15 she had 12 of her expected 14 students. She was about to begin when the door opened, and 2 boys came in at a run, nearly colliding with the corner of the front desk, catching themselves and standing in a breathless tangle of arms and jackets and apologies all at once. They were clearly brothers. The older one looked to be around 10, with dark brown hair that had been wetted down and was already rebelling, a serious face, and eyes the color of creek water in shade. The younger was perhaps 7 or 8, with the same dark hair but wilder, a gap where a front tooth had recently departed, and an expression of such unguarded delight at being somewhere new that Grace felt an immediate warmth toward him. "We are sorry, ma'am," the older boy said with the careful diction of someone reciting a prepared statement. "Our horse threw a shoe. We ran the last half-mile," the younger one added, as though this were an achievement deserving of recognition, which Grace privately thought it might be. "What are your names?" she asked. "I am Thomas Ramsey," the older boy said. "This is my brother Daniel." "Daniel Ramsey," the younger boy confirmed, sticking out his hand to shake hers with enormous seriousness, and Grace shook it. "Well, Thomas and Daniel Ramsey, I am Miss Callahan, and you are right on time," she said, which made both of them visibly relax. "Because we have not yet started. Find yourselves seats, please." She had a good first day. The children were rough around some of their letters and their numbers, as she had expected after months without instruction, but they were eager in the way that children who have been cooped up and bored all winter tend to be eager when something new is offered to them. She taught them a song to help remember the alphabet, which the older children bore with patient tolerance and the younger ones adored. She read the first pages of a story aloud to them at the end of the afternoon, and left off at a point that made several of them groan with the need to know what happened next, which she considered a successful day's work. Thomas Ramsey sat in the third row and paid attention with an intensity that was almost unnerving in a boy his age. He did every task set before him with complete concentration, and when she asked the class a question he waited until others had attempted an answer before offering his own, which was invariably correct. Grace noticed that he held his pencil awkwardly, and that his letters were formed correctly but with significant effort, as though each one had to be individually summoned. Daniel, in the second row, was pure enthusiasm poured into a child-sized container. He learned the alphabet song faster than any of them and sang it louder than all of them combined, raised his hand for every question regardless of whether he knew the answer, and at one point offered the information that his father had a horse named Copperhead who could open gate latches with his nose, which Grace acknowledged as genuinely impressive even while redirecting the lesson. At the end of the day, when the other children had been collected by parents or sent off in groups toward the various farms and homesteads surrounding town, Thomas and Daniel remained on the porch. Grace watched from the doorway as they sat together on the step, Daniel swinging his legs and talking constantly about something, Thomas listening with that same careful attention he gave everything. The man who came for them arrived on horseback, which was how most people arrived at things in Dusty Creek, but Grace noticed him anyway. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn canvas coat and a hat pushed back slightly on his head, and when he saw his sons on the porch, he swung down from the horse with the ease of someone who had been doing that particular motion since before he could remember. He walked up to the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands, and when he looked at Grace, she saw that he had the same creekwater eyes as Thomas, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind and probably a number of other things that left marks she could read but not name. "You must be Miss Callahan," he said. "I am Lewis Ramsey. I apologize for the boys being late this morning." "They explained," Grace said. "There is nothing to apologize for." "I wanted to come by personally," he said, "and thank you for taking the position. This town has needed a teacher." He paused, and something in his face shifted slightly, became a little less formal. "My boys especially. Thomas is 10 and he can barely write his own name. Daniel is 8 and he does not know his numbers past 20. That is not your doing, that is mine, and I wanted you to know I am aware of it." Grace looked at him with some surprise, because parents who acknowledged their own failures plainly and without defensiveness were not the most common variety in her experience. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, "but I do not think it does much good to assign blame. What matters is that they are here now. I watched Thomas today, and he is very bright. He just needs time and practice with the mechanics of reading. Daniel is going to fly through his numbers once someone sits with him consistently. Lewis Ramsey was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he nodded once. "I am glad to hear it," he said. "I will make sure they are on time from now on." He called the boys to him, and they came running. Daniel launched a verbal summary of the entire school day at his father before his feet were fairly off the ground, and Lewis listened to all of it with the same kind of patient attention that Thomas gave to everything, which Grace found suddenly and unexpectedly touching. Thomas walked to his father's side and leaned against him briefly, a small wordless communication, and Lewis put his hand on his older son's head for a moment before lifting him onto the horse's back. They rode off down the road, and Grace stood on the porch of the schoolhouse in the late afternoon light and watched them go and thought absolutely nothing in particular about it, or so she told herself. The weeks that followed were full and demanding in the way she had hoped. Dusty Creek's 14 children came to school 5 days a week, and Grace poured herself into their education with everything she had. She quickly understood the different shapes of their difficulties and their gifts. There was a girl named Clara Whitmore who was 13 and could do mathematics in her head faster than Grace could write the problems on the board, but whose reading was labored and halting. There were the Henderson twins, who were identical in appearance and completely opposite in temperament, one methodical and the other wildly creative. There was little Ana Morales, who spoke Spanish at home and was learning English through the school alongside everything else, and who progressed so quickly that Grace sometimes stayed after hours just to prepare additional materials for her. And there were Thomas and Daniel Ramsey, who came every day on time now, who sat in their rows and worked with the full force of their particular personalities, and who Grace found herself watching with a kind of invested attention that went a little beyond the professional. Thomas's reading was indeed a mechanical difficulty. He was intelligent enough to memorize passages after hearing them once, but when he had to decode printed letters into sounds and sounds into meaning independently, something in the process stalled. Grace had seen this before in her years of teaching, and she knew the approaches that helped. She began spending 15 minutes each day with him individually, using a method of her own devising that involved tracing letters in sand while speaking their sounds aloud, connecting the physical sensation to the mental recognition. Within 3 weeks, Thomas Ramsey read his first complete sentence from a printed page without any help at all. It was a sentence from a simple primer, unremarkable in its content, but the way he looked up at Grace when he had done it made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I read it," he said. "You did," she confirmed. He looked back down at the page for a moment, then back up at her, and in his serious face there was something completely unguarded and brilliant. "Can I do another one?" he asked. They did 7 more sentences before the rest of the class needed her attention. Daniel's mathematics came more easily. He had simply never been given the right framework, and once Grace gave him one, the numbers clicked into place for him with satisfying speed. Within a month he could count, add, and subtract with confidence, and was beginning to understand basic multiplication with the help of physical objects, pebbles and sticks and dried beans arranged in rows on his desk, while he worked through the patterns with fierce concentration. Lewis Ramsey came to collect his sons every afternoon. This was not entirely usual. Most of the children who lived on surrounding farms and homesteads made their own way home, the older ones in groups, the youngest accompanied by an older sibling or a hired hand. But Lewis came himself, every day, reliably and without exception. Sometimes he arrived a few minutes early and would wait outside on the porch while Grace finished the afternoon lesson. She could see his shadow through the window glass, patient and still. One afternoon in mid-October, about a month into the school year, She stepped out onto the porch to find him sitting on the top step with a piece of wood in his hands that he was carving with a short knife, shavings accumulating in a neat pile beside him. He looked up when she came out and stood quickly, putting the wood in his coat pocket. "The boys will be just a minute," Grace said. "I asked them to stack the primers before they left." "No hurry," he said. She sat down on the porch railing, which was not entirely proper but which she did anyway because her feet ached and the afternoon was warm. There was a pause between them that was not uncomfortable. "Thomas read me a story last night," Lewis said. "A full page. Read it clear through without stopping." Grace heard the weight of what was underneath those words, the particular kind of pride that was almost a different thing from pride, that was closer to relief, or to the undoing of a worry that had been carried a long time. "He is making wonderful progress," she said. "He has a very good mind. The reading will come fully in its own time, but he has already turned a corner." Lewis nodded. He looked out at the road for a moment. "His mother was a reader," he said. "She read to them both when they were small, before she died." Grace was quiet for a moment because that information changed the shape of several things at once and she wanted to be careful with it. "I am sorry," she said. "How long ago?" 3 years, he said. "Daniel barely remembers her. Thomas remembers her reading." Grace understood then why Thomas had worked so hard at the reading, with such stubborn, concentrated effort, as though it were not just a skill but something owed to someone. She looked down at her hands on the porch railing and felt that particular kind of ache that comes from understanding something at a depth beyond words. "She sounds like she was a wonderful mother," Grace said. "She was," Lewis said simply. He did not elaborate, and she did not press him, and in the space between those two things something changed very slightly. Some small door opened between them that had not been opened before. The boys came tumbling out of the schoolhouse then, Daniel talking before he was fully through the door, and Lewis rose to receive them with the ease of a man who was entirely comfortable in the role of being the thing his children ran toward. November arrived cold and fast, as Texas winters could when they chose to. The stove in the schoolhouse became essential rather than merely useful, and Grace arrived each morning earlier than the children to build the fire up properly, so the room was warm by the time they came in. She had developed a routine of the mornings, which she liked. There was something grounding about the smell of wood smoke and chalk, the particular quality of early light through those 4 windows, the process of writing the day's lessons on the board while the fire took hold behind her. She had also begun to know the town better, and the town had begun to know her. Mrs. Purdy introduced her to practically everyone who came through the general store, and Grace attended church on Sundays, which was also the primary social event of the week. She knew which families were struggling with a bad harvest, which men had come back from the war changed in ways that had not healed cleanly, which women carried the invisible weight of running households in a land that was still, in many ways, being made. She knew that Lewis Ramsey ran a cattle operation of modest size about 4 miles north of town, that he had a foreman named Pete Hicks who had been with him since before his wife died, that he was respected in town without being particularly social, and that the question of who would come to his assistance when he eventually needed it was one those around him seemed to have already quietly settled in his favor. She also knew, because she was paying attention and could not entirely stop, that when he looked at her, there was something in it that was not simple neighborly regard. She knew it the way you know a thing before you have decided what to do with the knowing. It was Mrs. Purdy who said it first because Mrs. Purdy had been alive long enough to say most things first. "Lewis Ramsey is a good man," Mrs. Purdy said one evening over supper in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a suggestion. She said it while buttering a biscuit and did not look up from the process. "I am sure he is," Grace said. "Lost his wife to the fever 3 winters back. Martha was her name. Fine woman. Quiet, thoughtful. He has never been the same, but a man with children does not have the luxury of being the same for too long." She finished with the butter. "He watches you, you know, when you come out of the schoolhouse. He is waiting for his children, Grace said. He could send Pete Hicks for his children. He has done it before, when he had things demanding his attention on the ranch. Mrs. Purdy bit into her biscuit and looked at Grace with eyes that were very old and very sharp. He does not send Pete Hicks anymore. Grace considered several responses and chose none of them, which Mrs. Purdy clearly found satisfying. It was a Saturday in early December when Lewis Ramsey came into the general store, while Grace was purchasing lamp oil and a bolt of fabric she planned to use to make curtains for the schoolhouse windows. He came in from the cold with cold in his coat and on his hat, and saw her at the counter before she saw him, so that when she turned around he was already looking at her with that expression she had catalogued but not yet named. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. "No boys today." "They are at the Fletcher ranch," he said. "Clara Fletcher has a new set of kittens, and apparently this is a matter requiring extended personal investigation." Grace laughed, which was a sound she noticed he seemed to like, though he did not quite smile outright. "Your boys are good friends with the Fletcher children," she said. "They are. And how are they getting on in school, truly?" "Truly," she said. "Thomas is reading 3/4 of the way through the second reader and working in the third. Daniel has mastered his multiplication tables through the 5s. Truly." Something happened in his face, that shift she had seen before, the loosening of something held tight. He came up to the counter beside her, close enough that she could smell the cold air on his coat and something beneath it, wood smoke and leather, and the particular clean smell of someone who takes care of himself in conditions that make it a deliberate choice. "I owe you a debt," he said quietly, not for the shopkeeper's ears. "You owe me nothing," she said, equally quiet. "Teaching is what I came here to do." "Not all teachers would have given Thomas the extra time," he said. "I have seen how you work with him individually. He tells me about it. You made him feel capable, not broken. That matters more than I can say to you standing here in a store." Grace looked at him directly, which was her custom when she meant something. "He is not broken," she said. "He never was. He simply needed someone to find the right door. Every child has a right door." They stood there in a small shared space of understanding, and the shopkeeper pointedly found something to do in the back room. "Would you—" Lewis started, and then stopped. He turned his hat in his hands, which she noticed was the physical equivalent of choosing words. "I wonder if you might do me the honor of having supper with me sometime, at the hotel dining room properly, not as a courtesy, as a matter of my own preference." Grace felt something warm move through her chest. She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things she wanted to see clearly. "I would like that," she said. His expression changed then in a way she had not seen before, a genuine relaxation, something almost young in it. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and said he would make arrangements with Mrs. Purdy about a suitable evening, which he did, and which resulted in Mrs. Purdy that evening at supper being insufferably pleased in the most restrained and dignified way possible. The supper was 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening when the sky was clear and cold, and full of more stars than Grace had ever counted in Missouri. Lewis arrived at Mrs. Purdy's door at 7, wearing a good coat and a clean hat, and Mrs. Purdy opened the door and looked at him for a moment with those sharp old eyes and said, "She is just getting her coat," which she delivered with the authority of a blessing. The hotel dining room in Dusty Creek was not a sophisticated establishment, but it had tablecloths and candles and a cook who had grown up somewhere in New Orleans and had opinions about food that he expressed through beef stew and cornbread that Grace thought was the best thing she had eaten in months. Lewis ordered coffee for both of them without asking, which she noted but did not mind because it was her preference too, and then seemed to catch himself and said, "Unless you would prefer something else," which she found endearing. "Coffee is perfect," she said. They talked. That was the thing that surprised Grace, or rather did not surprise her but delighted her, the ease with which they talked. She had expected a certain amount of the stiff politeness that characterized meals between two people who were still figuring each other out, and there was some of that at first, but it dissolved faster than she anticipated, carried away by the fact that they were both fundamentally curious people who found the same things interesting. He asked her about Missouri, and about what had made her answer the advertisement for Dusty Creek specifically, and she told him the truth, which was that she had wanted something larger in her life, a sky with more in it, a place that was still in the process of becoming. He listened the way he listened to his sons, fully and without the fidgeting that some people used as a way of seeming attentive while actually preparing their own next statement. She asked him about the ranch, and he talked about it with an unaffected directness that she appreciated, the realities of cattle ranching in 1878, the balance of water and grass and market prices, the work of building something in land that did not give itself easily to being built upon. He talked about the dry years and the good years without romantic inflation in either direction, and she understood from the way he spoke that he loved the work the way you love something that costs you something. "Do you ever think of going back somewhere easier?" she asked. "A city or further east?" He was quiet for a moment. "This land is where my boys were born," he said. "It is where Martha is buried. I am not sure easier is what I am after." She nodded. She understood that kind of attachment to a specific place, a deep rooting that had more to do with what had happened somewhere than with comfort or convenience. They walked back in the cold night air, not hurrying, and when they reached Mrs. Purdy's door he stopped and looked down at her with an expression she had finally found the name for. It was the expression of a man who was allowing himself to want something he had not allowed himself to want in a long time, and who was not entirely sure yet what to do with the permission. "Thank you for the evening," Grace said. "Thank you for agreeing to it," he said. There was a moment between them, standing in the lamplight from the window, the night air cold and still around them, and then he touched the brim of his hat in a small, precise gesture and said good night and walked back to where he had tied his horse, and Grace went inside and sat down with Mrs. Purdy by the fire and drank tea and said nothing for a while. Mrs. Purdy also said nothing, which in its own way said everything. December moved into its full cold, and the schoolhouse became a kind of center of Dusty Creek's winter life, in a way Grace had not entirely anticipated but embraced wholeheartedly. She organized a small Christmas pageant, which involved every child in the school and which required them to learn their lines by reading them, which she considered an elegant solution to multiple problems at once. The pageant was performed on the last day before the holiday break, in front of as many parents and townspeople as could fit into the schoolhouse, and Thomas Ramsey read a 2-paragraph passage from the Bible in a clear and steady voice that made Lewis, sitting in the second row of chairs with his hat on his knee, go very still in a way that Grace, watching from the side of the room, recognized as the stillness of a man holding strong feeling carefully. After the pageant, when people were milling about and talking and the children were accepting cookies from the refreshment table that Mrs. Webb had organized, Lewis found her near the bookshelf. "He read it perfectly," was all he said. "He practiced every evening for 2 weeks," she said. "He told me he wanted it to be right." Lewis looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to ask if I might call on you formally," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." Around them, the room was full of noise and warmth and children with frosting on their faces, and Grace thought that there was something entirely right about the setting, something that matched the particular shape of how this had begun. "It is agreeable to me," she said. What followed was the winter of calling on each other with the slow, deliberate care of two people who had already made some mistakes in the business of being known, and were not inclined to rush the process. He came to Mrs. Purdy's on Sunday afternoons, and they sat in the parlor and talked, and sometimes played cards when Mrs. Purdy joined them, which she occasionally did in a manner that made it entirely unclear whether she was chaperoning or participating. On warm enough days they walked, and Dusty Creek being a small town, Their walks were noted, and the noting of them was communicated in the particular efficient social telegraph that operates in small communities everywhere. Grace liked his company. This felt important to say plainly, even internally. It was not just the weight of what he had been through, or the tenderness he had for his sons, or even the quality of his attention. She genuinely liked him as a person. He was funny in a very quiet way that she caught when she was paying attention. He had strong opinions about things and was entirely willing to have them challenged, and would change them if the argument was good enough, which she found unusual and attractive in equal measure. He read when he had time, which was not often, but he kept a small shelf of books in the ranch house, and she discovered this when he invited her and Mrs. Purdy to supper at the ranch on a cold January Sunday, and she stood in front of that shelf while he was in the kitchen and felt a disproportionate warmth about it. The ranch supper was the first time she had seen him entirely on his own ground, in his own space, and it was illuminating the way that always is. The ranch house was solid and clean, and not comfortable in a decorative sense, but comfortable in the sense of a place that was genuinely lived in. The boys were in their element here in a way that made them louder and more sprawling than they were in the schoolhouse, running in from the barn to report on the state of things and running back out. And Lewis cooked a pot of chili that he served with good bread, and that was excellent. And he moved around his kitchen with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing all of it himself for 3 years, and had made a certain kind of peace with that. After supper the boys showed Grace the barn, which contained Copperhead the latch-opening horse, confirmed by Daniel with great ceremony, 3 other horses, and a barn cat of immense seniority who accepted attention with queenly condescension. Thomas showed her a book he had hidden in the hay of his horse's stall, which he sometimes came out to read when he wanted quiet, and which was currently a thin volume about natural history that had pictures of animals from Africa that he found, in his words, extremely strange and interesting. "I want to see a real one someday," he said, looking at the picture of an elephant. "I think you could," Grace said. "The world is very large and full of things worth seeing." Thomas looked at her with his serious eyes. "Do you think you will stay in Dusty Creek?" he asked. Grace understood that this question had more inside it than its surface. She looked at the boy carefully. "I think Dusty Creek is where I am meant to be," she said. "I am not going anywhere." Something in Thomas settled at that, a small visible relaxation. When she came back inside from the barn, Lewis was at the kitchen table washing the supper dishes, which struck her as a detail she wanted to keep somewhere. This big, quiet, capable man standing at his sink with his hands in soapy water, the lamplight yellow around him, the winter night outside the windows. He looked over his shoulder when she came in, and his expression was that particular one she had named, the one of careful, permitted wanting. "The boys are good guides," Grace said. "They have been talking about showing you the barn for 2 weeks," he said. "I hope Copperhead performed." "On demand," she confirmed. He dried his hands and turned around, leaning back against the counter. "Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix, and it sounded different in his voice than it had anywhere else she had heard it. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly." "Please," she said. "I have not been easy to know since Martha died," he said. "I know that. I pulled in and did the work and raised the boys and did not leave much room for anything else. I do not entirely know how to do this, what this is." He gestured between them with one hand, an uncharacteristically uncertain motion. "But I know that Sunday afternoons are the part of the week I most look forward to. And I know that whatever is growing here, I do not want to be careful with it to the point of losing it." Grace crossed the kitchen and stopped close enough that she would have had to only reach out to touch his arm. "I am not a fragile thing," she said, "and I am not going anywhere. I told your son so, and I mean it. Whatever this is, I am not frightened of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and held it with the particular quality of a man holding something he intends to be careful with regardless of what she said about fragility. "I am glad you came to Dusty Creek," he said. "So am I," she said. "Very glad." February arrived, and with it a crisis of a different kind, which was that a man named Harold Greer, who owned a large piece of land to the east and who had opinions about what Dusty Creek Schoolhouse should be teaching and what it should not, came into the schoolhouse on a Wednesday morning with complaints delivered at a volume calibrated for maximum impact. His complaint was, ostensibly, that Grace was spending too much time on reading and not enough on practical arithmetic, by which he appeared to mean that the children were learning things he considered unnecessary. But Grace understood very quickly that the real complaint was more general, that it had to do with what he called outside ideas being brought into the town by a single woman with no family and no roots, which he said with the particular emphasis that indicated what he really meant by that. It was a kind of opposition that Grace had encountered before. She was a single woman, she was educated, she had opinions and she expressed them, and in some men this combination produced a friction that was not really about anything she had actually done. She stood her ground in her own schoolhouse with absolute composure, told him that her curriculum was determined by the educational standards of the state of Texas and the oversight of Mr. Aldous Webb, both of which she was glad to discuss with him through appropriate channels, and that her classroom was currently in use, and she would have to ask him to continue any further conversation outside and after school hours. He left, not entirely satisfied, and the children who had witnessed the exchange were very quiet for a moment before Anna Morales raised her hand and asked if they could please continue with the story they had been reading before the interruption. "Yes," Grace said, "we absolutely can," and she went back to the page she had been on with the steadiness of someone who has decided what she is made of and is not reconsidering the question. The matter did not entirely go away. Greer went to Mr. Webb, and Mr. Webb came to Grace, and they had a frank discussion in which Mr. Webb made it clear that he supported her entirely, but wanted her to understand the political landscape. "Greer has money and he uses it to have opinions in this town," Webb said. "He cannot remove you without a vote of the school board, which is me and 2 other men who think well of you, but he can make noise." "Let him make noise," Grace said. "I will teach." Lewis heard about the Greer visit before she had a chance to tell him herself, because Dusty Creek was that small, and he came to the schoolhouse that Friday afternoon with an expression she had not seen on him before, one that was very controlled and very focused in a way she suspected meant he was managing a significant amount of feeling. "I heard about Greer," he said. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I heard that too." He paused. "Grace, I want you to know that if Greer or anyone else in this town causes you difficulty, you are not managing it alone. This is a small community and my voice carries some weight in it, and I intend to use that weight on your behalf." Grace felt a complicated warmth that she took a moment to examine before responding. She appreciated his protection genuinely, but she also needed him to understand something. "Lewis," she said carefully, "I am capable of fighting my own battles. I have been doing it for years. What I want from you is not someone to fight in front of me." He met her eyes. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and the question was direct and open, not challenging but genuinely asking. "I want someone standing next to me," she said. "Not in front of me. There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a fair distinction. I will try to remember it." "You are doing well so far," she said, and he almost smiled. Greer made no further direct approaches. The school board conversation went nowhere because Webb blocked it. Life in Dusty Creek went on. Spring came back, warm and fast the way Texas springs could be, and with it the anniversary of the school term, which meant Grace had been in Dusty Creek for a year. She noticed this privately, standing on the schoolhouse porch one morning before the students arrived, looking at the mountains that were purple against a pale, early sky, and thinking about the woman who had chased her hat down the street 12 months ago. That woman had come here looking for something wider. She had found considerably more than she had known to look for. The children had grown, not just in inches, though that too, but in knowledge and in confidence, and in the particular kind of expansion that happens when a child understands that they can learn things, that their mind is a capable instrument, that the world has things in it they can access and understand. Thomas Ramsey was reading The Fourth Reader and had begun borrowing books from Grace's own small library, which she had carried in one of those 2 traveling bags from St. Louis. He read, with a hunger now that she thought probably had something to do with his mother, with learning to carry something of her inside himself. Daniel had progressed so far in his numbers that she was working on fractions with him, and he found the whole enterprise hilarious in a way she could not entirely explain but enjoyed. On the last day of the school year, Grace organized a small exhibition. Each student prepared something to show their families: a piece of writing, a mathematical calculation, a recitation, something that demonstrated what the year had given them. The schoolhouse was full of parents and siblings and neighbors, and the afternoon light came through the windows Grace had curtained in the fabric she had bought that day in the general store, and the room smelled of chalk and wood, and the particular smell of many people in a warm space together. Thomas went to the front of the room and read, without stopping, without stumbling, without the laborious decoding that had once been his relationship to the printed page, a full page from a book about American history. He read it clearly and steadily, and when he was done he looked up at the room with those serious Creekwater eyes, and Grace saw in his face the completion of something, a circle closed, a debt paid in the currency of his own capability. Lewis, in the back of the room, was not quite crying, but it was close, and Grace loved him for that and for the fact that he did not try to hide it. It was later, when people were clearing out and the boys were with their friend Billy Henderson and his father, that Lewis found Grace at the front of the room putting books back in their right places on the shelves. "You gave him that," he said. She turned to look at him. "He gave it to himself," she said. "I just opened the door." He crossed the room and stood before her, and she saw that everything he felt was fully present in his face, none of it managed or held back, and it changed him, made him look younger and less careful and more entirely himself. "Grace," he said. "Lewis," she said, which carried all its own weight. "I am not very good with the right words," he said. "You are better than you think," she said. "I have been in love with you since approximately January," he said, "and I have been trying to find the right time to say so, and I think there is no right time. There is just the time you choose." Grace felt the whole warm, impossible reality of it settle around her. "I have been in love with you since the barn supper," she said. "When I saw your shelf of books." Something in him shifted entirely, and he laughed, a real laugh which she had heard before but not often, and which she intended to hear considerably more. "My books," he said. "A man who keeps books," she said, "in a house he runs alone because he wants to, because he finds them worthwhile, is a man I would like to know for a very long time." He reached out and touched her face, which was the first time he had done that, and she leaned into it slightly the way you lean toward warmth. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I want to do it properly, which means not standing in a schoolhouse after an exhibition, but I need you to know that I am going to ask, so that when I do ask it does not come from nowhere." "I appreciate the advance notice," Grace said. "I will be prepared with an answer." "Will it be yes?" he asked, with a directness that made her want to laugh. "I think we both know what it will be," she said. He kissed her then, carefully and then less carefully, and it tasted like everything she had come west looking for and had not known to name. He proposed properly 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, at the supper table of his ranch house with the boys at full attention across from them, Daniel practically vibrating, Thomas with his hands folded and his expression entirely composed, and somehow also entirely delighted. Lewis produced a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone the color of the Texas sky, and Grace looked at it in his palm and felt the whole length and breadth of what it meant. "Grace Callahan," he said, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of being my wife?" "She is going to say yes," Daniel announced, unable to contain himself any longer. "Daniel," Thomas said. "She is," Daniel insisted, looking at his father. "He is right," Grace said. "Yes, Lewis. Yes." Daniel erupted from his chair and had to be physically redirected by Thomas, who managed this with patient older brother expertise while maintaining his own composure except for the smile that broke through his serious face and stayed there, open and bright, and Grace thought that smile was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Lewis put the ring on her finger and Daniel was beside them both immediately, wrapping his arms around whoever he could reach, and Thomas came around the table more slowly and stood next to Grace and said, quietly, "I am glad you stayed," which undid her completely. "I am glad I stayed too," she said, and pulled him into a hug that he accepted with only a small show of the reluctance that 10-year-old boys consider appropriate in such situations. The wedding was set for September, which gave the summer to the business of settling things. Grace told Mrs. Purdy, who received the news with enormous and dignified satisfaction, and then immediately began making plans for the wedding breakfast, which she appeared to consider her personal project and which Grace was delighted to hand to her. Grace wrote to her sister in Missouri, who wrote back with a long, excited letter that promised her presents and several strong opinions about wedding arrangements, all of which Grace found entirely welcome. There were practical matters to address. The school board, after some discussion, agreed that a married teacher was not irregular, which in 1878 was a more contested point than it might have been elsewhere. But Dusty Creek School Board was pragmatic and liked what Grace had done for the town's children, and Mr. Webb made his position clear. Grace would continue teaching. She had made that a condition, stated plainly to Lewis before the engagement, and he had not even paused before agreeing. "I know what you are," he said, "and teaching is a part of it. I would not ask you to stop being yourself." This was, Grace thought, perhaps the most important thing anyone had ever said to her. The summer was warm and long and full. Grace began dividing her time between Mrs. Purdy's room and the ranch, not in the improper sense, but in the sense of learning the place and the rhythm of it, understanding what her life there would look like. She learned the names and personalities of all 4 horses and the senior barn cat. She learned that Pete Hicks, the foreman, was a man of few words and deep loyalty, who communicated his approval of her through a series of small practical gestures, like fixing a squeaky gate she had mentioned in passing and leaving the repaired fact of it without comment. She learned that the ranch required a kind of constant attention that was different from teaching but similarly engrossing, and that Lewis moved through it with a competence she found deeply attractive. She also learned that he had a small study off the main room where he sometimes sat in the evenings after the boys were in bed, reading or doing the ranch accounts, and that this room had a second chair that had never quite found a natural position in the space. And one evening in July, she moved it to a spot near the window and sat in it with a book while he did his accounts, and neither of them said anything about it. And that was perhaps when the ranch began to feel like home. Daniel, that summer, decided to teach himself to read music, inspired by the fact that there was a church organ in Dusty Creek and its player, old Mr. Soren, had agreed to show him the basics. He came to Grace with his characteristic enthusiasm and asked her to help him understand how written notes related to sounds, which she thought was an entirely lovely use of the reading skills she had taught him. And she spent several Saturday mornings working through the basics of musical notation with him at the ranch house table, while Lewis watched with an expression of bemused and tender pride. Thomas, that same summer, worked his way through a book about surveying that Grace had brought in her traveling bags, having included it more or less by accident when she was packing for Dusty Creek. He came to her one morning with specific and sophisticated questions about land measurement, and Grace discovered that the child had a genuine mathematical gift that Daniel's enthusiasm had somewhat obscured, a quiet systematic intelligence that went deep. She wrote to a colleague in Austin about resources. Her sister Alina arrived in late August, on the stagecoach that Grace had arrived on a year and a half earlier, and Grace stood on the main street and watched Alina chase her own hat down the road in the August wind and laughed until her eyes watered. Alina was 30, 2 years older than Grace, with the same auburn hair and a more immediately expressive face, and she took in Dusty Creek, the ranch, Lewis, and the boys with a rapid and thorough attention that Grace recognized as the family trait. Her verdict on Lewis was delivered on the second evening privately, while the two of them sat on the ranch porch in the cooling night air. "He looks at you like you hung the stars," Alina said. "He does not," Grace said. "He does," Alina said. "He is also very handsome, which I mention only as a secondary consideration. The main thing is that he listens to you like you are saying the most interesting things he has ever heard, and the boys love you, which is the truest possible test." Grace looked at the dark fields and the stars above them, which were genuinely extraordinary in this part of Texas, a fullness that you could not see from a city. "I am happy," Grace said, which was not something she had ever said with quite this particular simplicity. "You look it," Alina said. "You look like you are exactly where you are supposed to be." The wedding was on the second Saturday of September, 1879, in the Dusty Creek Church with the white steeple. Grace wore a dress that Mrs. Purdy and Alina had conspired to produce, ivory cotton with pale blue trim that matched the turquoise in her ring, and she walked down the narrow aisle on Mr. Webb's arm because that was what the occasion required, and because Mr. Webb was obviously and visibly moved by the role, which touched her greatly. Lewis stood at the front of the church in his good coat and a new shirt, hat in his hands, and when he saw her he went completely still in that way he had, and then something in his face opened fully, and she had never seen him look exactly like that, entirely without the last traces of careful management, entirely present. Thomas stood next to his father as the best man, 11 years old and utterly serious and proud. Daniel stood on his other side and was almost perfectly still, which represented a significant personal achievement. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony with the economy of a man who understood that the words themselves were the thing and did not require embellishment. They said their vows to each other in the full presence of about 40 townspeople and Alina and the afternoon light through the church windows, and when Lewis said, "I do," he said it looking directly at her with the entirety of himself in his face and voice, and Grace felt it like something taking root. When the Reverend said he could kiss the bride, Lewis cupped her face in both his hands and kissed her like she was something he intended to take very good care of for the rest of his life, and the church made the sound of 40 people being genuinely moved, and Daniel said audibly, "Finally," from the front row, which made Thomas pinch him, and which made the whole church laugh, and Grace laughed too, against Lewis's mouth, which seemed to her to be the absolutely right way to begin a marriage. Mrs. Purdy's wedding breakfast was served in the church hall, and it was a production of considerable ambition. Ham and roasted potatoes, 3 kinds of bread, 2 cakes, a pie that Mrs. Henderson had contributed, and quantities of coffee and lemonade. People ate and talked, and the boys ran in and out, and Alina danced with Pete Hicks, who turned out to be an unexpectedly good dancer, and turned an interesting color about it. Mr. Webb gave a toast that was quite moving and only slightly too long. Lewis found Grace near the window at one point, a brief island of relative quiet in the cheerful noise of the party, and put his hand at the small of her back. "Hello, Mrs. Ramsey," he said quietly. Grace thought about the woman who had chased a hat down this town street looking for a wider life, a sky with more in it. She turned to look at her husband, at the lines of his face and the warmth in his eyes and the whole improbable gift of him. "Hello, Mr. Ramsey," she said. The autumn that followed was the best kind of settling, the kind that is not settling for less, but rather settling into more than you expected. Grace moved fully into the ranch house, transforming the space in ways that were practical and personal without erasing what it had been, adding books to Lewis's shelf, adding curtains that matched the schoolhouse ones, adding herself to the rhythms of the household until she could not have said when the rhythms became ours rather than his. She was still the schoolteacher. She walked to school most mornings and came home in the late afternoon, and the ranch organized itself around this fact as naturally as everything else. Lewis took the boys on mornings when she had preparations to do. Pete Hicks, who had quietly expanded his definition of his responsibilities to include anything that might make Grace's mornings easier, had fixed not only the gate but also the porch step and the cabinet door in the kitchen that stuck, all without being asked. The boys were a different kind of settled, too. Thomas, now in his 11th year and reading at a level that Grace estimated was several years above his age, had developed a habit of saving his best discoveries for her, coming to her in the evenings with a book open to a page and saying, "Listen to this," and reading her passages that he found particularly worthy of consideration. She always listened, and she always responded genuinely, and this private literary conversation between them was something she considered one of the finest things in her new life. Daniel had progressed to actual pieces on the church organ and performed a short composition at the Christmas service that made Lewis press his lips together very tightly and look at the ceiling for a moment before recovering his composure. He was also helping his brother with advanced arithmetic in a way that had entirely reversed their original academic dynamic, and Thomas accepted Daniel's mathematical assistance with the dignified tolerance of a person who knows that different minds have different gifts. In March of 1880, Grace discovered she was carrying a child. She told Lewis on a quiet Sunday morning while the boys were at the barn, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, one that was newer than the others she had catalogued, something profound and almost reverent. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the first question he asked, and she would remember that. "I am very well," she said, "tired in the mornings." Mrs. Purdy already suspects. She has eyes like a hawk. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands, and she looked at his face looking at her and felt the full specific weight of this moment in the house they had made together. "Grace," he said, and then stopped, because some things are too large for easy words. "I know," she said. "I know." The boys received the news with reactions entirely true to their characters. Daniel immediately had opinions about names and delivered them at length. Thomas said very little for a day, and then came to Grace in the evening and asked if he could put his hand on her stomach to feel if the baby moved, which it did not yet, but she took his hand and placed it there anyway. "Will you teach this one too?" he asked. "When the time comes," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and she knew what he was really asking, which was whether she was planning to stay, whether she was planning to be here in the particular ongoing way that matters most, and the answer to that was a thing she intended to demonstrate every day for the rest of her life. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Grace was grateful for in a land where uncomplicated was not guaranteed. Lewis was attentive without being anxious, which she appreciated because she had expected him to be anxious and had prepared arguments for why he did not need to be. He was not anxious. He was present in his particular way, making sure there was always firewood and that the porch was clear of ice in the cold mornings, and that someone was available to manage the schoolhouse on the occasions when she needed rest, which she managed by training an older student named Clara Whitmore, now 14 and practically a small teacher herself, to lead lessons under certain circumstances. The baby was born in October of 1880, which brought the year around to almost exactly 2 years since Grace had arrived in Dusty Creek. He was a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first moments of an expression of dignified outrage that made Lewis laugh and that Grace found entirely wonderful. They named him James, for Lewis's father, and William as a middle name, for no one in particular but because they both liked how it sounded, and Daniel declared James William Ramsey to be, in his expert assessment, an excellent baby. James was indeed an excellent baby, once he had adjusted to the general situation of existing in the world, which took a few weeks. He had Lewis's dark hair and Grace's eyes, and a loud and opinionated personality that appeared to belong entirely to himself. The boys adored him in different ways, Daniel energetically and Thomas carefully, and the ranch house acquired the particular atmosphere of a home where there are children at multiple stages of growing. That winter Lewis taught Grace to ride well enough to cover the 4 miles between the ranch and town without requiring assistance, which she had insisted on learning, because she did not want to be dependent on anyone else's schedule. He was a patient teacher, which she noted with some satisfaction, and she was a determined student, and within 6 weeks she could ride the bay mare Lewis had assigned her with a confidence that surprised him. "You have good instincts," he told her. "I had a good teacher," she said. He looked at her with that quiet warmth that had become the background color of their life together, constant and solid and true. The town of Dusty Creek grew in those years, as the territory filled with people coming from the east for land and opportunity. New families meant new children, and the schoolhouse that had held 14 students in 1878 held 23 by 1881 and would need expansion before long. Grace brought this to Mr. Webb with a specific plan, measurements, cost estimates, a timeline, a list of which families might contribute labor and materials in lieu of money, all of it organized with the efficiency of someone who had been making arguments for what children needed and winning them for some years now. The expansion was approved. The building went up over the course of a spring, largely through the contributed labor of the town's men, and Lewis spent 3 of those Saturdays working on the framing alongside other fathers, and Grace brought food at midday and watched him work and felt proud of him in a way she rarely found words for but did not need to. The new school had 2 rooms now, a junior room for the younger children and a senior room for the older ones, and Grace hired a second teacher, a young man named Robert Tanner fresh from a teaching college in Dallas, who was nervous and capable in roughly equal measure, and who Grace proceeded to help into competence with the same methodical patience she used on her students. James began walking at 11 months and was into everything immediately and without pause. He had opinions about where he wanted to be that did not always correspond with where he was permitted to be, and he communicated these opinions at volume. Lewis managed him with the practiced ease of someone who had already done this twice, and found it, on this 3rd pass, entirely delightful rather than exhausting, which Grace suspected had something to do with the fact that he was not managing it alone this time. In the summer of 1882, Lewis took the whole family, including Mrs. Purdy, who had become grandmotherly to the entire operation, to San Antonio for a week, which was the largest city any of the boys had ever seen, and which Daniel described in a letter to Alina in such comprehensive detail that Alina wrote back saying she felt she had been there herself. Thomas bought 3 books from a bookstore that he discovered on the 2nd day, and which he visited every remaining day of the trip. James ate a tortilla and approved of it significantly. Grace and Lewis walked the city in the evenings after the boys were in bed in the hotel room with Mrs. Purdy, and there was something about being in a different place together that sharpened the edges of things, made her see him in new contexts and know him in them. He was at ease in the city, more than she had expected, adapting to its scale without being overwhelmed, navigating it with the same competence he brought to everything. He bought her a small journal with a blue cover from the same bookstore Thomas had favored, and said that he had noticed she wrote her thoughts down, and he thought she ought to have a proper book for it, which was entirely true, and which she had not known he had noticed. They stood one evening on a bridge over the river and watched the city's lights reflected in the water, and Lewis put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and felt the warmth of the life they had built moving through her like something steady. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the same question Alina had asked her the summer before the wedding. Then her answer had been simple. Now it was layered deeper, more completely true. "I am happy in a way I did not know I was looking for," she said. "Before I came to Dusty Creek, I knew I wanted something larger. I thought it was the land, the sky, the space, and those things are part of it. But the largest thing turned out to be this." She turned to look at him directly. "You and the boys and the life we have. That is the largest thing I found." He looked at her for a long moment with those creekwater eyes, and then he kissed her on the bridge with the river lights below them and the warm Texas night around them. And it was everything it had ever been and more besides. Thomas, at 14, was preparing for the possibility of higher education. Grace had been quietly corresponding with a school in Austin that offered advanced studies, and Thomas had taken to the idea with the same concentrated seriousness he brought to everything, working through additional mathematics and writing with fierce private discipline. Lewis had mixed feelings about his older son going to Austin, which were composed of pride and the specific grief of a parent watching a child prepare to leave. And he and Grace talked about it many evenings, working through the feelings with the honesty that had been the ground of their relationship from the beginning. "He is going to go further than Dusty Creek," Lewis said one night, not unhappily but with the weight of truth in it. "He is going to carry Dusty Creek with him," Grace said. "Everything he learned here, the reading, the years of working at things that were hard, the books you kept on that shelf in your study, he carries all of it." Lewis was quiet. Then he said, "You told him the world was large and full of things worth seeing. When you were in the barn that first winter, he told me you said that." "I meant it," Grace said. "I know." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I am glad he heard it from someone who knows how to mean things." Daniel, at 12, had continued with his music and had taken on the role of the church organ's primary player on Sunday mornings, displacing old Mr. Sorin, who was glad to be displaced and sat in the front row with enormous approval on his face every week. He was also, with characteristic Daniel energy, deeply involved in helping Pete Hicks with the ranch's daily operations, having declared at some point that he was going to run the ranch when he was old enough, which Lewis received with quiet satisfaction and which Grace thought was probably true. James, at 3, was fully in possession of the world as he understood it, which he understood primarily as a space designed for his personal investigation, and from which interesting things could be obtained if you were sufficiently persistent. He had Lewis's gravity in miniature and Grace's curiosity in full size, and the combination produced a child of such complete and confident personality that people who met him tended to find him remarkable without being able to say exactly why. He had also, as of the spring of 1883, begun to ask with some frequency why Thomas read to himself and Daniel played music, and he could not yet do either of these things. "You are 3 years old," Lewis told him, with enormous patience. "I want to read," James said, in the tone of someone stating a reasonable requirement. Grace looked at her youngest son and felt the particular joy of seeing something she recognized, that specific hunger for the capability of understanding marks on a page and making them into meaning. "Come here," she said, and put him on her lap at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and began where she had always begun, with the shapes of the letters and the sounds they carried, the same place she had begun with Thomas 5 years before in the Dusty Creek schoolhouse, the same place she had begun with every child she had ever taught. James put his small hand around the pencil and looked up at her with eyes that were entirely her own, that same particular shade of gray-green, and waited with the intense focus of someone for whom this moment is already important. "The first letter," Grace said, "is called A." Lewis came in from the barn half an hour later and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his wife teaching their youngest son his letters at the kitchen table, the afternoon light falling across them both. James's small head bent over the paper with absolute concentration, Grace's hand guiding his, her voice patient and warm and clear. He stood there a moment, watching, and felt the full weight of everything that had happened in the years between the raw, grieving man he had been before she came and the man he was standing in this doorway. And it was not a simple feeling, because it contained Martha and the loss of her and the years of managing alone. And it also contained the miracle of this woman who had arrived on a stagecoach chasing her hat in the wind, and had walked into the schoolhouse, and had given his son's words, and had given him the possibility of something he had stopped believing he could have. He cleared his throat softly, and Grace looked up at him, and the look between them carried all of it, everything that could not be said in ordinary words on an ordinary afternoon in their own kitchen. "He is going to be relentless about this," Lewis said, nodding at James. "Absolutely," Grace agreed. "He gets that from you," Lewis said. "He gets everything good from both of us," Grace said. "Sit down, you can hear the lesson." Lewis sat down across the table from them, and James looked at his father and said with tremendous seriousness, "Papa, the A says ah," and Lewis said, "Does it?" And James said, "Miss Mama says so." Grace looked at Lewis over their son's dark head, and the smile between them was slow and full and entirely their own, compounded of every morning she had walked to the schoolhouse, and every Sunday afternoon on Mrs. Purdy's porch, and every evening in his study with the second chair by the window, and every night they had talked long past when the lamp should have been put out, and every one of the 1,000 ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built jointly from scratch in the wide, good country of this land. Outside the windows, the Texas sky was enormous and blue and completely itself, and the mountains were purple on the horizon, and the world was as large as she had ever hoped it would be, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she knew it with the fullness of a woman who had come looking for something, and had found it in the very last shape she expected, in the form of two boys who needed to read and their father who needed something he did not yet know how to name. And in a schoolhouse at the edge of a town where the wind stole your hat and the stars at night were beyond counting, and the right life, it turned out, was never the one you had planned but the one you were brave enough to walk toward when it appeared. James mastered the letter A that afternoon, and moved on to B with the determination of someone who intends to finish what they start. His mother watched him with pride so complete it had no sharp edges. His father watched his mother and thought, not for the first time, not for the last, that he had been given something extraordinary, and he intended to be worthy of it for every remaining day that was given to him. Daniel came in from the ranch with mud on his boots and a question about supper, and stopped short in the doorway, took in the scene at the table, and said, "Are we teaching James to read already?" "He asked," Grace said. "He always asks," Daniel said, dropping into the empty chair with a grin. "I remember when Thomas asked you to teach him, he did not stop until he could." "None of the Ramseys stop," Grace said. Lewis looked at her across the table. "No," he agreed, "we do not." Thomas came in an hour later from his room where he had been reading, drawn by the smell of supper that Grace had started and Lewis was finishing, and found his entire family at the kitchen table, James now holding his own pencil and making determined marks on a piece of paper that were not yet letters but would be. Daniel explaining the alphabet song to James in a version slightly different from Grace's original, that James was already preferring on the basis of Daniel having added a part about horses. Lewis at the stove listening to all of it with a quietness that was nothing like the quietness of loss, and everything like the quietness of a man who is where he most belongs. Thomas stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, and then he went to his place at the table and opened his book. And the kitchen was full of voices and warmth and the smell of supper, and outside the windows the last of the Texas day was burning itself out in long red lines across the western horizon, magnificent and ordinary and entirely, completely home. It had begun with a schoolhouse, with a woman from Missouri who wanted a wider life, with a man who came every afternoon to collect his boys and stayed on the porch a little longer each time, with two children who needed to read and a teacher who knew how to open doors. It had become this, A family in a kitchen in the blue Texas evening, letters being learned and books being read and music playing in the church on Sunday mornings, and the mountains always there on the horizon, and a love that had grown from the small, careful space of two adults finding each other through the middle ground of what mattered most to both of them, through the act of a woman who believed in what children could become, and a man who loved his sons enough to let someone in. Grace Callahan had come west looking for something larger. She had found it. She had found it in the very best and most enduring way, in the kind of love that does not announce itself with trumpets but arrives quietly, lesson by lesson, afternoon by afternoon, until one day you look up from what you are doing and realize that the life around you is the largest thing you have ever been inside, and it fits.